Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to talk about Love and Marriage in the Age of Jane Austen by Rory Muir. An excellent book to get stuck into during Jane Austen July, particularly if you are looking for a book to fulfill the non-fiction reading prompt. In this book, Rory Muir meticulously tracks the evolution of courtship and marriage in the late 18th and early 19th century, during the times that Jane Austen lived and wrote. Through his detailed examinations, he's able to shed light on the social norms, customs and relationships which would have influenced her writing. It's something that a lot of people do bring up, is that while with her leading ladies and leading men, Jane Austen will depict the courtship period of their relationships, she rarely gives us much of a glimpse into their married life. And she also doesn't tend to depict weddings or even mention them on the page. That tends to be reserved for the film and TV adaptations. If marriage is commented upon, it does tend to be side characters. The research in this book is so comprehensive, covering every element and stage of a relationship. We go from the initial meeting and courtship through to proposals both accepted and declined, the engagement period, the drafting of marriage contracts, of dowries, the wedding itself, the honeymoon period, the early days of married life, how careers and children affected marriages, as well as those who either chose or just happened to not have children, all the way through to old age and widowhood. He also examines the roles of mistresses and other affairs and adultery, elopements, violence and other forms of abuse within marriage, separations, divorces, and even explores the lives of those who chose not to get married. All of these topics are documented in their own separate chapters, in a logical start to end progression. So all of the information presented feels really well set out and flows really nicely from one chapter to another. Rory Muir's main sources for this period are letters and diary entries, of which he quotes from quite extensively in order to illuminate his points. And he does this because he notes that the popular perception of Georgian marriages is that they were generally unhappy, often uncaring, regularly adulterous. But this popular perception comes more from things like satirical prints and newspaper clippings, which will always show more dramatized, more sensationalized marriages, because obviously that's what sells. You know, figures like Georgian, Duchess of Devonshire, and her very unhappy marriage, figures like Lord Byron, and also the influence of the Victorian era on our perception of the Georgians, how the Victorian era was really reactionary to the Georgian period, wanting to stress the immorality of that earlier stage. But by using diaries and letters, Rory Muir is able to demonstrate that all of this sensationalizing was very much the exception to the rule. And while not all marriages would have been happy, not all of them would have been love matches, many marriages in this time period were happy, were content, or at the very least were calm, with couples actually displaying a lot of affection to each other. In particular, letters written by the Ogilvies were a particular highlight. Being able to see this couple grow old together and still retain their affection for each other. Their letters are just infused with this adoration, and it was really, really sweet to read. While the book's title may suggest a very heavy reliance on Jane Austen's work, this is actually not the case. Rory Muir uses Jane Austen as a reference point, yes, but does not overuse or depend very excessively on her work, on her characters and narratives in order to illuminate his points. Rather, Rory Muir maintains a strong focus on historical evidence to guide his content, and Jane Austen's characters and stories are used to complement this historical evidence, adding depth and further examples where needed, but to points that have already been made. It's a really careful balance that he had to maintain, so that this book in itself is a credible historical resource rather than just being literary analysis. And despite the overwhelming amount of information and anecdotes that Rory Muir uses, this book is never dry or too academic in tone. Many academic works of this nature can just feel like mindless listing off of evidence without much form or structure, or really taking care in the writing to make it fun and enjoyable to read. But I think this book is very readable, very accessible, with a really natural flow to the writing and effective use of its case studies and anecdotes. And you really get this rich, varied image of Georgian society and their attitudes to love and marriage. It's all too easy to fall into the trap of being like, this is what the belief was at the time and therefore everybody did this, no exceptions. And I tend to get very irritated by grand sweeping statements like that. But the Georgians that Rory Muir portrays are multifaceted and diverse in their opinions and behaviours. Yes, there is a mould that people are expected to uphold, but it's very clear that not all of these people do uphold that mould and these conventions of the time, and very many don't believe that they should have to. Rory Muir will present the standard of the time, the conventions of the time, but will always take time to reference those who subverted expectations, broke from tradition, or simply times where the expectation did not meet the reality of what people were actually doing en masse. You know, for a very common example, the standard may have been to have no sex before marriage, but considering the amount of women who went down the aisle pregnant, or parish records showing the number of babies being born just a handful of months after the wedding ceremony, obviously suggests otherwise. I also really like that Rory Muir is clear to address where there are areas of little primary evidence, and he just can't elaborate because the evidence isn't there for it, or at least if it is there, there's too small smaller sample to be able to demonstrate a wider pattern. So things like sexual relations, there are very few letters and diary entries that go explicitly into detail. Things like contraception, LGBTQ plus relationships. You know, there is some evidence, for example, he does talk a lot about Anne Lister's diaries in here, but we can't use one diary entry to say this is what happened and this was the case for every female-female relationship. Even documentation of relationships between grandparents and grandchildren are quite scarce, and he isn't able to comment too much on that, which I thought was very interesting. But despite the scarcity of sources in these different areas, he uses what he can as effectively as possible, and in so doing is able to bring a fuller picture of love and marriage in this era. But as I say, not afraid to show where there are gaps in the narrative. So yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this book. I think if you already love Jane Austen, if you love Bridgerton, if you love Regency romance, this is a really great non-fiction to pick up to enhance the knowledge that you already have. It will give you details about different historical figures that you've never heard of before, and it's just good fun to read as well. Do let me know if you've read this book or if you're interested in picking it up. I would love to hear any more recommendations of non-fiction to read during Jane Austen July. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.